The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon and a warm welcome to all. I am Ridhra on behalf of Care Ratings. Welcome you to our today's webinar, wherein we'll be discussing on will India be able to bring down the logistic costs. Appreciate your time in joining us for this webinar. To take you further on this, may I introduce our speakers for today. We have with us Mr. Padmanabh Bhagavath, Senior Director at Care Ratings, Puja Jalan, Senior Manager, who will be joining us from our Hyderabad office, and Urvisha H. Jagasheth, Research Analyst, Industry Research from our Mumbai office. The discussion is in form of a presentation which is visible on your screen. In case of queries, there will be a Q&A session no sooner the presentation ends. Any questions, you can please key in the slot provided. May I request Mr. Bhagavath to begin the proceedings?
Thank you, Mradul. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we discuss in detail about our webinar topic for the day, good, and also encourages investments in the country. The Government of India also recognizes the importance of the sector, and in order to augment the growth, has granted the infrastructure status to the logistics industry in order to avail credit at competitive rates, which on a long-term basis could aid in the export competitiveness. The scope of the logistics industry has also broadened from rudimentary transportation of goods to include end-to-end supply chain solutions, which includes warehousing and express delivery. Going forward, the industry is expected to drive the growth in the manufacturing, retail, FMCG, and e-commerce sectors. But before that, the Government of India has set the target to bring down the current 14% logistics cost of India's GDP to 9% by 2022, and has requested the ministries of railways, transport, shipping, and aviation to work in tandem in order to reach the goal. To discuss further on the topic, I will now be handing over the presentation to Urvisha to explain the current structure of the logistics industry and the trend in freight transportation.
Thank you, Bhagwat sir. So before we begin with the webinar, I want to discuss a little bit about the structure of the Indian logistics industry and the value chain. The logistics value chain comprises of the transportation segment, the storage segment, and the value-added segment. The transportation segment accounts for approximately 85% of the total value, and its share is expected to remain high over the next few years. Overall, the players can also be segmented on the basis of origin of service provider and types of services it provides. The key segments include rail, road, coastal transportation, warehousing, cold chains, container freight stations, and inland container depots. Now, under support services, you have the third-party logistic players, or you have the 3PL, and you have fourth-party logistics or 4PL players. 3PL is a concept where a single logistics service provider manages the entire logistics function for a company. In 4PL logistics, it is completely controlled by a service provider that does not own any of these assets to carry out the logistics, but outsources it to subcontractors. 4PLs facilitate single point references for all logistic needs. They possess a knowledge of the logistics to obtain the most efficient and effective solutions. Moving on to the trends in the trend in the cargo handled by the various segments. It is important to understand the trend in cargo handled by the domestic players, and of the various modes of transportation, roads and railways are the most preferred mode, accounting for approximately 65% and 26% of the total cargo volumes handled respectively. The share of the other transportation modes comprising of inland shipping, pipelines, and airways remains minimal, accounting for the balance 9%. Going forward, development of logistics-related infrastructure such as dedicated freight corridors, logistic parks, free trade warehousing zones, and container freight stations are expected to improve the overall efficiency of the cargo handled. The industry demand drivers. As Mr. Bhagavath mentioned, the Indian logistics market is expected to be driven by the growth in the manufacturing, retail, FMCG, and e-commerce sectors. The sector provides employment to more than 22 million people and has significant bearing on the exports. Now, the emergence of MNCs has been one of the key demand drivers for the upsurge of the logistics industry. Global MNCs prefer a highly efficient supply chain which can connect the manufacturing location with the consuming market at the lowest possible cost. The emergence of 3PL and 4PL players. While the Indian 3PL market is still very much in its infancy as compared with the other countries, it is experiencing healthy growth and attracting new companies eager to capitalize on its plentiful opportunities it offers. The same is the case with 4PL operators as well. Moving on to our next point, that is modernization of the manufacturing systems. With the advent of artificial intelligence, there has been a complete modernization of the manufacturing systems, which play a key role in supporting the transportation and logistics industry. Improved technology also has increased the productivity in the supply chain, minimizing the cost and errors. These advances benefit all areas of the logistics value chain, especially in the case of trucking transportation, international transportation, that could be ocean and air, supply chain management, and ship tracking. Improved technology has also given rise to many logistic-related startups such as Delivery Rivigo. The increasing investment in logistic parks. The concept of a logistic park has gained attention from both the public as well as the private players. A large number of special economic zones have also necessitated the development of logistic centers for the domestic market as well as for trade purposes. For example, you have this real estate firm ESR Hasty, which has tied up with Future Group to develop 2 logistic parks with an investment of approximately rupees 300 crore. You have All Cargo 2, which is investing rupees 1000 crore in the development of a logistics park. With the second last point, the government support towards the development of cold storages. The logistics industry will not prosper if there is no proper storage, and for that, the government has identified cold storages as a thrust area for development and recommended the creation of cold storage infrastructure. Through the Pradhan Mantri Kisan Sampada Yojana, the ministry is also following a transparent selection process and online filing of claims for the infrastructure development projects of mega food parks and cold chains. Lastly, the e-commerce sector has probably been the biggest revolution in the retail industry, and this trend is to continue in the years to come. Online retail business is the next generation format which has high potential for growth in the near future. After conquering physical stores, retailers are now foraying into the domain of e-tailing to leverage the digital retail chains, which could enable them to spend less money on real estate while reaching out to more customers in Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities. We believe with the growing popularity of e-commerce, it will also commensurate in the further developments of the logistics sector pertaining mainly to transportation and storage services. Now coming on to the challenges slide. For the logistics industry to grow, there are a few teething issues which the industry needs to overcome in order to further grow. Firstly, the Indian logistics industry has been adversely affected by the lower standardization of cargo and containerization of logistics traffic, which is hampering the overall speed and thus increasing the cost of storage and movement. Secondly, the need for large capital and issues related to land acquisition has also tempered with the growth of the sector in the past. The third point, and extremely important point, is the high cost of logistics to GDP. The Government of India has an ambitious plan to bring down the logistics cost from the present 14% of the GDP to less than 10% by 2022, and is in the view that high cost logistic cost is hurting the competitiveness of domestic goods in the international market. To understand the reasons for the high logistic cost and the policy measures undertaken by the government to tackle the same, I would now request to I'd like to hand over the webinar to Ms. Puja Jalan to take the webinar further.
Thank you, Urvisha. As stated by Urvisha, the sector has been facing several challenges, and one of them is the high cost of operations, which as a percent of GDP stand at about 14% for India. So it's quite pertinent to ponder over the factors driving the high logistic cost in the country. For a better understanding, we have broadly divided the factors into high dependence on road transportation and secondly on the inventory management issues prevailing in the sector. Looking at high dependence on road transportation, as we saw earlier while Urvisha was explaining about the trend in the cargo handled by the various modes of transport, the road transportation has the giant share in the entire logistics segment and has an approximate share of about 65%, with railways share being about 35% and a minuscule share of the other modes. So an approximate working of the cost of freight movement as per a report of World Bank works out to be rupees 2.28 per ton per kilometer for the roads as compared to just 1.14 per ton per kilometer for the rail and 1.19 per ton per kilometer for the waterways. This apart, the road logistics also is inefficient in terms of consumption of fuel, with a differential of about 3.5x and 4.3x in terms of tonnage per liter of fuel. Hence, no doubt the cost of goods movement by the road is about 80% higher vis-a-vis that of rail and more than double that of water, resulting in higher cost for the industry. Now let's focus on the reasons driving the increased usage of road transport, despite India's geography favoring other modal mixes given its vast coastline and navigable inland waterways of about 14,500 kilometers. The factors can be summarized as inadequate infrastructure, absence of efficient multimodal connectivity, and inefficiencies prevailing across the value chain. We'll take all these factors one by one now. Inadequate infrastructure. The inadequate infrastructure stems from the saturation of the existing rail network in the high freight traffic zones, as well as slower development pace of the other networks, particularly the dedicated freight corridor. Now, as per a study of the Indian Railways, across 247 high-density lines, about 66% of the sections are running at 100% and above capacity, with 32% lines running at above 120% capacity, and another 10% running at about 150% capacity. Normally, this has resulted in high congestion, and ultimately, the impact is on the growth of the freight load, which we would cover in our next slide now. We see the freight load trend of the Indian Railways, wherein we can see that the freight load carried by the Indian Railways have been continuously increasing since 2014, where it was about 1,000 million metric tons per annum in 2014 and reached up to 1,200 plus million metric tons in 2019. However, we can see that the growth rate has only been about 4 to 5%. Hence, switch to road is preferable for faster turnaround and avoid service delay associated with the rail network. This apart, the inland waterways have also not been able to develop due to a host of factors such as lack of industrial units near major river sketches and hence lack of cargo commitment from the firms, low depth level of rivers and associated high dredging cost and impact of the ecosystem. Continuing with the other factors in the next slide. We see that there is a high dependence on the road transportation because of absence of efficient multimodal connectivity, wherein poor connectivity between the origin and destination and lack of network of rail route basically has resulted in high usage of road. network. This apart, there is absence of connectivity between the container freight stations as well, which again results in high dependence on the road transport. This apart, there are inefficiencies surrounding the existing system, which also drives up the cost. While we have been saying that there is a lot of cost differential between the railways, waterways, and road, the benefit, however, can be realized only if the inefficiencies in the existing rail network are plugged. Lower reliability, high transit times, shortage of wagons are some of the reasons which ultimately result in high inventory in transit and higher cost. This apart, the road transport network also has its own issues of poor road infrastructure, old vehicle fleets, which all add up to the high logistic cost. Inefficiency in load size also goes a long way in reducing cost, as fully loaded trucks carry higher cargo per kilometer. Hence, loading efficiency can be achieved by moving towards larger trucks and or aggregating smaller loads into larger ones. The second segment, as we discussed earlier, which results in higher cost, is the inventory management issues. Now, warehousing roughly contributes about 15% of the logistics industry by value. The domestic warehousing market is highly fragmented, with most of warehouses having an area of less than 10,000 square feet and approximately 90% of warehousing space in the country being controlled by unorganized players. So the inefficiencies stemming out of the sector, which contribute to the high logistic cost, can be basically divided into high inventory loss and excess inventory storage. Speaking about high inventory loss, India, being an agrarian economy, infrastructure surrounding storage of perishable and non-perishable goods play an important role in defining the cost structure. While all supply chains experience normal loss due to theft, obsolescence, and transit loss, the loss arising from perishable goods due to infrastructural inadequacy is the one which adds to the cost. As per the Ministry of Food Processing Industries, the requirement of cold storage in the country is of 61 million tons, whereas the existing capacity is only about 32 million tons, thereby catering to about 50% of the requirement and leaving a shortfall of about 50%. Consequently, the loss rate in the perishable goods supply chain is high, as about 40% of the total agricultural produce in the country. Ultimately, the impact is high cost. Now, the other cost associated in the inventory management chain is the trend of excess inventory storage. Holding up inventory for a longer time duration, or rather, holding larger inventory, both require relatively high working capital to fund the inventory, and associated costs ultimately add up to the logistic cost. The fragmented nature of warehouses, with small space available per warehouse, lack of mechanization, and longer transit time involved, all lead to higher inventory storage by firms to ensure their smooth operation. Now, all these factors have ultimately resulted in high cost. So, to tackle the problem of the high cost, a host of measures and policies have been implemented by the government, which we would cover in our section now. Now, implementation of goods and service tax, which everyone knows was a key milestone towards reduction of inefficiencies and bringing down the logistic cost. Post-implementation of goods and service tax, there has been a consolidation in the warehousing space, with larger warehouses coming up at various clusters vis-a-vis small warehouse in every state, which was a trend earlier prior to implementation of GST. And now we see logistic warehouse clusters being created, which has ultimately resulted in reduction of inventory level by about 20 to 30%. Now, the key warehouse clusters emerging are Bhiwandi in Maharashtra, which caters to majority of e-commerce players delivering for Western region, the Neelmangala Dubaspet stretch on the outskirts of Bangalore, Hidimetla near Hyderabad, and also Pune, NCR, and Chennai are witnessing warehousing clusters. So GST has already been implemented. Now, with a view to reduce the logistic cost to 9% over the next 3 years, which is the broad line or the outline of our session today, the government has framed a draft national logistic policy. The few of the key thrust areas of the policy with which the government aims to reduce the logistic cost are as follows. Firstly, optimizing the multimodal mix from present 60% of road, 30% of rail, and 10% of water to about say 25-30% of road, 50 to 55% of rail, and 20 to 25% of the water route. Second, driving development of multimodal logistics park and promoting efficiency for movement of key commodities. An important step towards this has been according infrastructure status to activities such as multimodal logistic park, cold chain to enable them access to infrastructure finance, external commercial borrowings, and longer tenor funds from the other financial institutions. Third key thrust area has been creating a single window logistics e-marketplace to bring in greater transparency and faster clearance. Fourth has been strengthening the warehousing sector through technological advancement and creating specialized storage. Now, while the National Logistics Policy Framework, a draft has come out, it is yet to be finalized. However, there are various other policy measures and plans which the government has already implemented. And in the next slide, we would discuss and brief some of the projects under implementation, which are expected to bring down the cost. For enhancing the road infrastructure, government has announced the Bharatmala Pariyojana. The project aims at construction and upgradation of national highways covering a length of 34,800 kilometers for optimizing efficiency of freight and passenger movement across the country by bridging critical infrastructure gaps and also enable multimodal integration. Now, as we discussed earlier also, that an important point has been development of multimodal logistics park. Now, under Bharatmala Pariyojana itself, we see that a network of 35 multimodal logistics park has been identified in phase 1 of the program. The availability of land parcels for development of such parks has been confirmed at about 7 locations, and DPRs have been initiated in all the nodes. With the development of this proposed network, a 70 to 80% of the road transport, basically the freight, is expected to move on the national highway network as against 40% at present, thereby having a positive impact on the logistics performance index for India. We would cover more about the LPI in our slides going forward. Presently, projects with aggregate length of 6,400 kilometers have been awarded, and the draft project reports are under preparation for all these stretches. The project is expected to be completed by 2022-23. While we have covered the road infrastructure segment, moving to the railway segment. As discussed earlier, the high-density routes of the Indian railways are fully saturated, including Indian Railways quadrilateral linking the 4 metropolitan cities of Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai, and Kolkata as represented by Howrah, along with its 2 diagonals, which is the Delhi-Chennai section and the Mumbai-Howrah section. These all sections together comprise a route length of about 10,122 kilometers, which is about 16% of the total route of Indian Railways. This particular stretch also accounts for about 58% of the revenue earning traffic of the Indian Railways, and also the national highways along these corridors comprise a meager share of just 0.5% of the road network, but carries almost 40% of the road freight. Hence, to tackle all these issues, government has implemented the dedicated freight corridor program along the eastern route, which covers Ludhiana in Punjab to Dankuni in West Bengal, and western routes, which covers Dadri in UP to JNP in Maharashtra. So this implementation is subsequently expected to result in decongestion of the saturated rail route connected with the road network and promote higher efficiency. Let us look at the snapshot of the project. The total cost is estimated to be about 814 billion for the eastern and the western routes put together, which is proposed to be funded with a debt equity of 3:1. The eastern corridor has a funding support from World Bank, and the western corridor has a funding support from Japan International Cooperation Agency, that is JICA. Coming to the progress, land acquisition for both the freight corridor, that is the eastern and the western, has been completed for about 95% on an overall basis, and the project has achieved 66% financial progress and 69% physical progress as we speak on November end. Trial runs have also been conducted on 641 trains. This entire project is expected to be completed by 2021. So apart from these 2 freight corridors, government is also under consideration of 4 more freight corridors, which is under the planning stage. Now, we covered the road infrastructure, the railway infrastructure. The third important link to the multimodal connectivity is the National Waterway Project. With a view to leverage the vast inland waterway network, as we spoke earlier, and reduce the logistic cost, government has undertaken development of the Ganga Waterway, named as National Waterway Project 1, at a cost of about 5,300 crores, for which part funding is being done by the World Bank with a loan of USD 375 million. The project is a part of multimodal transport network being planned along the river. Now, an interesting point is this project will link the Eastern Dedicated Freight Corridor and also with the other areas' existing network of highways. So these are basically the three different projects and each multimodal mixes which would help in reduction of cost going forward. Now, beyond the efforts of government, the recent few years have witnessed growth of logistic tech startups, which are also contributing towards improvement in efficiency and reduction in cost. One of the key reasons for the high logistic cost in the industry is relatively low technology adoption in transportation or warehousing segment, and hence growth of several logistic tech startups are bringing about a paradigm shift in this space, which would eventually help in cost reduction. Various areas wherein technology can make a change are app-based shipment tracking system, digital payment usage by the truck drivers, use of RFID in storage space, Internet of Things, cloud technology, robotics, artificial intelligence, and also integration of technology with 3PL. So all this has ultimately resulted in growth of the logistic tech startups, which have been able to raise funds from various PE players focused upon the sector. And some of the logistics players, the relatively larger ones, have been able to raise funding of about $1.2 billion and over the past 2 years. So some of the large logistic tech up players are Delivery, Blackbug, Revigo, Grey Orange Robotics, etc. Now let's delve into the aggregate financial performance of the industry. Looking at the financial performance, what we see is that companies have registered growth both in transportation and storage verticals, whereby both volume of cargo and material handled across the value chain has resulted in continuous increase in revenue during the past 4 years. The PBIT margin, that is profit before interest, lease, depreciation and tax, however, vary in the sector based on their positioning in the value chain. The service-based companies, predominantly the storage solution providers, have higher margin vis-a-vis the logistic one. As we can see the chart on the left-hand side, the logistic players witnessed margin contraction in FY18 as post-GST, whereas consolidation were taken up. Initial streamlining of operations also resulted in reduced margin, and also there were closure of loss-making entities for several larger companies, thereby impacting the overall margin. However, based on the financials of entities for FY19, which have started coming in for the unlisted entities as well, what we see that the margins have started witnessing improvement in the year. Now, coming to the capital structure of the entities in the sector, a majority of companies have adopted asset-light model, which has kept the overall debt under a control level, with companies operating on a lease basis rather than operating on their own trucks or warehouses. Consequently, the gearing ratios of the entities are at a controlled level. Let us now take a look at the portfolio performance and rating dispersion of some of the companies rated by CARE in the logistics space. Out of about 224 rated entities, we see a 39% fall in the investment grade, with AAA ratings being about 1.8%, A-band ratings being about 4%, and the balance comprising BBB rating. Some of the AAA rated entities by CARE are Container Corporation of India, Konkan Railways, South Asia LPG, and Gujarat Chemical Port Terminal. Now, moving on to portfolio performance, the modified credit ratio of the sector helps evaluating the performance of companies by ascertaining the number of upgrades over the number of downgrades. The MCR has been below unity for the past 3 years, which reflects higher downgrade versus upgrade. The decline in credit quality is basically on account of inefficient utilization of assets impacting the profitability and liquidity, fraud and theft perpetrated in the warehousing segment, capex plans which are yet to culminate in benefit, and slower growth in various industrial segments which directly impact the segment performance. So as we have already covered the modified credit ratio, we will now move to the next slide, which is moving from care rated portfolio to the overall performance of the logistics players in the country as evaluated through Logistics Performance Index. Now, Logistics Performance Index, or LPI, is an interactive benchmarking tool which has been developed by World Bank. Once in every 2 years, World Bank comes out with a LPI index, which scores countries based on efficiency of domestic and international freight logistics. It takes weighted average of 6 parameters to arrive at the final score. Let us look at these parameters. They are efficiency of clearance process by border control agencies, including the custom, quality of trade and transport related infrastructure, ease of arranging competitively priced shipment, competence and quality of logistics service providers, example, the transport operators, the brokers, ability to trace and track shipments, and timelines of shipment and reaching destination within the expected delivery timeline. Now, LPI 2018 gives relative ranking of about 160 countries across the globe, and India stands at 44th position in the LPI in 2018. Whereas Germany stands the first position with a score of about 4.2, and India's score is about 3.18. Now, as we can see from the chart, India's ranking had improved from 54th to 35th between 2014 and 16. And the reasons behind are the improvement in infrastructure programs like Make in India and technological and digital improvements in the logistics supply chain. However, interestingly, or basically surprisingly, it has slipped by about 9 notches in 2018, despite implementation of GST and other policy measures, which is due to lower scoring on almost all the parameters, particularly the infrastructure. So it very well, it clearly appears from this that the results of the policies and the other government programs on the infrastructure would take further time to reap benefit and have a positive impact on the LPI. Nevertheless, amongst the category of lower middle income grouping, India has been the top performer along with Indonesia. So to sum up the entire discussion of today's webinar, what we can say is that the development of logistics related infrastructure, as discussed above, are expected to gradually improve efficiency in the sector and bring down the cost structure, subject to overcoming challenges with respect to financing, land acquisition, and receiving approvals in a fast track mode. This apart, the integration of the sector with the IT-enabled services would also go a long way in facilitating business prospect and improving the operational efficiencies. The industry is expected to grow at about 10 to 15% in the medium term, and the growth complemented with the cost reduction would aid the profitability of the companies in the sector. Comparison of the logistic cost across the countries brings out an interesting fact to us. While USA was also at a similar stage wherein the logistic cost was roughly 14% in 1982 and it was reduced to about 9% in 2002. So what we see is that the cost reduction is quite possible for India as well, wherein currently we stand at about 14% of the GDP and government proposes it to bring down to 9% in next 3 years. However, the envisaged timelines remain to be seen by us, as the cost reduction in proper time frame is dependent upon a lot of factors which we have just covered. So with this, we come to an end of the presentation.
Thank you, Puja. The participant will be having a break of 2 minutes before we begin our Q&A session. In case of queries, you are please requested to key in the questions. I repeat, we'll be having a break of 2 minutes before we begin our Q&A session. In case of any queries, you are please requested to key in the slot provided. Thank you.
So we have a question which says, what would be the impact on fleet operators due to auto slowdown? Till when is it expected to recover? Though I cannot comment on when it is expected to recover, we can broadly say that the current slowdown in the automobile segment is due to the whole liquidity crisis, which is persistent in the country due to the NBFC lending, which has been curtailed. Also, the whole industry is going through the transformation of changing their fuels from BS4 to BS6. And another reason, which again, where road logistics could be comprehending and coming into picture, would be the big the because of the axle load norms, which has increased the carrying capacity of these trucks, and that has led to the decline in the sales of CVs. So, and that has also led to fewer CVs on the road. So due to that, the impact is felt on that aspect as well, because there's been a revision in the axle load norms. However, if it does not answer your question, you can still email us. We can probably tail this to the auto analyst, because we are mainly talking of the logistics point of view in this webinar.
We have another question which says, can you highlight the delay in the implementation of the dedicated freight corridor project? So the program has been delayed by about, say, 4 to 5 years is what I can say. And what we see is that while the project was initially expected to get completed somewhere around 2015 and 16, the revised timeline is about 2021. There has been obviously several reasons because of which the project has got delayed, and the most important one and the pertinent one is obviously the land acquisition issues, which has resulted in the delay. However, as I was covering in the earlier slides, now it is almost about 95% complete, the land acquisition, and also construction is completed by about 65%, and hence the timelines now appear to be achievable.
So again, continuing with the question asked earlier, the logistics service providers' perspective, the improvement of infrastructure and availability of multiple modes such as inland waterways, the pricing might go down, but what is the cost? It is not expected to reduce much. Does this imply a compression of operating margins? See, the thing is, you can't really say that this could lead to a compression of operating margins, because there are a lot of the industry has a lot of factors which are involved, which is leading up to the increase in the high cost. One, as I think Puja had mentioned, is a lot of fragmentation is there in the entire value chain. Secondly, there's one more phenomena which also takes into place, is a lot of petrol pilferages. There's a lot of that also taking place, which is affecting the margins. The improvement of the infrastructure and availability of the multimodals, yes, the pricing will go down with that, but also it's very important to make sure that our operators, from the operators point of view or from the entire implementation point of view as well, the pricing is well managed. Secondly, again, the margins cannot, right now the margins are again compressed because of the economic slowdown, so that factor is also there. So from a logistics service point of view, a lot of efforts are being made to get this price down. It's just a matter of waiting and as a wait of watch to see how it is.
Also, to add to that, we had, covered in our segment as to what are the different freight rates for the different modal mixes and how, the railways and the waterways are much more energy efficient also as compared to roads. So what we see is that when all these interlinkages come into place, it may not have an impact on the margins.
We have a question which says, do we see a logistic cost increase in the event of BS6 norms implementation? Well, I don't think that will affect it so much per se, because see, it will increase the cost of the automobile, or it could also, there could be an increase in the cost of the fuel, but again, it could get compensated by, if there's an improvement in the infrastructure or the mobility of the road transportation, the cost could come down. So they could be nullified, but I don't see a very steep increase because of the implementation of the BS6 norms. We have another question which says, do we see any policy frameworks to ease over-dimension carriage movements to curb the RTO fines or to curb the corruption by the RTO? Well, to be honest, this is something which is a very policy government framework related, so it's very tough for us to comment on what policy or any framework could come. But maybe how there is something, how the Motor Vehicle Amendment Act has come into place and introduced a host new fines in the system, and at the same time how you got e-challan coming into place. Probably going forward and taking inspiration from that, there could be a policy framework maybe in the place for it. It's just a matter of wait and watch.
Okay, so we have another question. It says, within the logistics industry, which are the specific segments which are facing heightened pressure, thereby impacting credit profile and subsequent downgrades? Now, as you rightly said, first of all, that there are various segments within the logistic industry. The one which we see currently has been facing certain issues are the one which have a lot of assets in their books, especially the transport operators which are asset intensive, and they are not able to efficiently deploy those assets, resulting in optimum utilization of their fleet. So they are the ones who currently have been facing some kind of a credit profile issue, because again their capital structure would be relatively leveraged as compared to others. And the second set of people which recently we have come across, or wherein we see that there is some kind of a credit profile weakening, is the companies which are operating the trade facilitation business, particularly in the warehousing and the storage space, wherein they hold a lot of commodities for trade facilitation backed by certain agreements. However, given this holding of huge commodity and associated inventory risk, if there is any fraud perpetrated in the segment or if there are other issues, the directly impacts the margins given the provisioning which is required. So yes, these two other major segments which we see currently have been facing credit issues. We have another question which says, what growth do you foresee in the port logistic and airport logistics sector? Now, currently, the freight contribution from the port logistic and airport logistic is together close to about 7%. So while the port logistics sector is definitely expected to grow away more from that 6%, given the Sagarmala project, which is under implementation, and also the inland waterways, we don't see much on the airport logistics sector growth contribution as a percentage of the overall logistics picture, taking into consideration the road, rail, airport, and port all put together.
We have another question which says, do you think blockchains can get implemented to solve the issues in the Indian logistics? So I don't know about the whole blockchain point of view, but at least I can say that most of these startups which I've come across, that is like Rivigo and Dunzo and the ones that we mentioned in the PPT, they are using a lot of artificial intelligence to go about with their operations, and that has been making a lot of difference in the entire logistics value chain. For example, the most of these startups are having GSP devices which I've come across with their trucks. So there's a proper way of tracking the movement of these trucks from one location to the other. They have also come up with a different shift position. So not, a driver is not driving for not more than probably 5 to 6 hours, and it's getting the adequate rest they need. These they're also trying to make sure that most of their trucks are properly temperature controlled, and probably with that AI they're also seeing the sensors and making sure there's no kind of pilferages which is happening. Also, one important thing which is adding on to the cost of these logistics players is that there's a lot of fuel pilferage. Again, that also has been done with a lot of anti-theft mechanism. So blockchain, maybe time coming per se, somebody could come up with something, but as of now, AI has pretty much taken forward with these logistic players.
Okay, so we have another question which says, could you please highlight the major challenges faced by the container freight station operators? So the container freight station operators, first of all, as we have seen in the past 2 years, the performance have been improving and it is on a growth trajectory. However, the major challenges which they are facing is obviously the cargo volume growth, which for some of the entities have suffered a setback because of lower import volumes of, say, the coal cargo, wherein, and so the container freight station operators surrounding the major ports, wherein coal cargo is a major commodity driving the cargo volumes. So in 2018, several container freight station operators, what we see, had some issues of reduction in the volumes. So the cargo volume plays a major role in their operations and driving their credit profile as well.
We have a question which says, with the industry size itself being around 215 billion and the required investment for the currently under implementation projects itself being over 800 to 1,000 billion, do we see an investment issue? Since these projects are promoted by the government of India, but then private investments have not taken up as well. So, as you have pointed out, yes, the investment size is quite high, and at the moment there is a liquidity crunch which is being faced in the economy, and there is also a slowdown in the economy which is curtailing these investments coming forward. So, even if the government is promoting these projects, the government always is in the power of raising zero coupon bonds or any kind of bonds which can, a government backed bonds which could raise the kind of capital they need. Also, since they are government backed projects, the government can also do a disinvestment in a particular entity and gather the funds needed to carry forward with these projects. In the case of private investment, it's not picked up yet because there needs to be some kind of trust of how these project implementations go forward. And with the kind of size and scale, it will be a very government oriented project when it comes to your roadways, because again, this is a very country, and so it's from a point of view of the it's point of view of the country development. So there's no kind of, there could be like a maybe a percentage of share of the private investments coming into place, but majorly it will be government backed, and if needed, the government always has resources and means to raise capital from the economy.
Also, I would like to add one point here. See, majority of these projects at several stages have not been opened up for a public-private participation because of the liquidity crunch at the private sector, and also because the private sector players have kind of burned their hand in various other beauty projects which were floated. So what we also see here is that the government has been tying up the funding requirement with, say, Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, as well as the Japan International Cooperation Agency. So it has been seeking international funding support to implement these projects and expand the infrastructure.
We have a question, and what are our thoughts on the usage of upcoming electric and solar vehicle in the logistics sector? I think it'll be a great move if the logistics sector can have electric and solar vehicles. The initial cost could probably be high, probably in terms of acquiring of the vehicle, but this also again depends on which company they are purchasing it for and how competitively it is priced. But it saves up a lot on the fuel it saves up a lot when it comes to procurement of fuel. And if in the case of electric vehicles, the problem one of the problems which logistic entities face is oil pilferages. That also will considerably go away, like that will completely go away. So it will be a very good move if this comes into place for logistic players.
I think that was the last question taken up for the day because we're running short of time. There are a couple of queries which have been unanswered. We'll be replying that by email across to you. Thank you again to the participants for taking your time out and being a part of this Care Ratings webinar. You're most welcome to put forth your suggestions, feedback, or any queries in the suggestion box, which will be coming no sooner the webinar ends. Thank you and goodbye for now.